The chains arrived before he did. That is how people remembered it later. Not the wagon, not the crowd, not the heat pressing down on that Alabama square in the summer of 1857. What they remembered first was the sound, heavy iron moving through morning air, cutting through every other noise until there was nothing left but that sound and the waiting. The town of Greenvale had seen auction days before, too many to count. The wooden platform at the center of the square carried the weight of years in its grain, worn smooth by the feet of countless people who had stood on it and been reduced to numbers. The men who ran these sales knew how to move a crowd, how to build excitement, how to turn human beings into transactions without letting anyone think too hard about what they were actually watching. They were professionals. They had done this so many times that nothing surprised them anymore, or so they believed. The whispers had started 3 days earlier, traveling from farm to farm, the way whispers always do in small places, arriving ahead of the truth and growing larger with every mile. Some said a man was coming who could not be explained. Others said the traders who had transported him had stopped talking about the journey entirely, as if something had happened on the road that none of them wanted to describe. A few said he had not been captured in the usual sense, that the word captured did not quite fit, that found was closer, though found suggested he had been lost, and nothing about this man suggested he had ever been lost anywhere. By the morning of the auction, the crowd was larger than anyone had expected. They came from further away than usual. Farmers who rarely made the journey into town, merchants who had no business being there, women who had never attended an auction in their lives, children who had been told to stay home and had come anyway. They filled every inch of the square, pressing against each other in the heat, and not one of them could have said exactly why they had come. Curiosity was the word most of them used. But curiosity does not make a man leave his fields before sunrise. Curiosity does not bring a woman 15 miles in the back of a wagon to stand in the sun for hours. Something else had brought them, something they could not name and would not try to. The traders arrived at mid-morning. The wagon came in slowly, the wheels finding every rut in the road, the sound of the chains beneath the canvas arriving first. The crowd parted without being asked. People stepped back naturally, creating a path that no one had organized, as if the body understood before the mind did that something was approaching that required space. The traders sat up front with the particular exhaustion of men who had been on a long road and were glad to see it ending. They did not look at the crowd. They looked straight ahead, or at the ground, or at their hands. For men who usually worked a crowd from the moment they arrived, their silence was strange enough to notice. The enslaved people were brought down from the wagon one at a time. Each person was guided toward the platform with the mechanical efficiency of a process that had been repeated too many times to feel anything during. The crowd watched with the detached attention they had brought to these events before, faces showing the particular blankness of people who have trained themselves not to feel what they are seeing. And then the last person stepped down. He did not wait to be guided. He simply stepped down from the wagon and onto the ground, and the square went quiet. Not gradually, not the way a crowd quiets when something interesting happens. It went quiet the way a room goes quiet, when someone walks in who changes the nature of the room, simply by being in it. One moment there was noise, the next moment there was not, and in the silence Nelson stood in the Alabama sun and looked at nothing in particular, and yet somehow at everything at once. He was not what the whispers had promised. He was not impossible to look at. He was not surrounded by any visible strangeness. He was a man, tall, steady, his posture so precisely upright that it looked less like pride and more like a simple refusal to let the weight of the morning bend him. His face was composed in a way that went beyond calm. It was the face of someone who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the world to catch up. The chains hung from his wrists like an afterthought. A woman near the front of the crowd said something in a low voice. No one responded, but the man beside her removed his hat. He did it slowly and without thinking about it, and when he realized what he had done, he put it back on quickly and looked away. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began. He was a man who had built his confidence on his voice, on his ability to command attention and move a crowd from hesitation to action without giving them time to think between the two. He had opened hundreds of these sales. He knew exactly how to set a price and then exceed it, how to play one bidder against another, how to make a room feel as though it was in competition with itself. He was good at his job. He had never been good at anything else and had never needed to be. But when he turned his full attention to Nelson and began to speak, something went wrong with his voice. Not dramatically, not in a way that everyone noticed immediately, but the rhythm he always relied on was slightly off. His words came out in the right order, but without the usual momentum behind them. He described what he saw, the strength, the build, the years of labor ahead, the standard language, and the crowd listened, but they were not listening to him. They were watching Nelson, and Nelson was doing nothing except standing there, which was somehow more powerful than anything the auctioneer could have said. The bidding began with a hesitation that the auctioneer tried to talk past. He urged the crowd, named a starting price, and waited. The first bid came slowly, then a second. Then the competition he was used to building took shape, voices rising over each other, the energy of acquisition beginning to override the unease that had settled into the square. Men who had arrived only to watch found themselves bidding. Men who had set a limit in their minds before they arrived found themselves exceeding it. The platform was doing what it always did, turning people into participants before they noticed the change. Then Nelson raised his head and looked at the crowd. It was not a dramatic movement. It was slow and deliberate, his gaze moving across the gathered faces one at a time. Not searching, not accusing, simply looking, meeting eyes the way a man looks at something he is trying to understand completely, or something he already understands better than anyone else in the room. The man who had placed the highest bid stopped mid-breath. He stood with his mouth slightly open, the next number already formed but not spoken, and something in his expression shifted. Not fear exactly, something closer to the feeling of being suddenly unsure of where you are, or what you came here to do. He lowered his hand, stepped back, said nothing. The man beside him, who had been ready to counter, shook his head as if clearing it, and looked away. A third man, known in the region as someone who did not lose auctions and did not tolerate losing them, frowned at his own hands, as if they had done something without his permission. One by one, the voices that had been filling the square went quiet. The auctioneer tried to hold it together. He repeated the last bid. He urged the crowd. He raised his voice and then raised it again. But the energy he was trying to resurrect was no longer there. The silence had returned, and this time it was heavier than before. Then a single voice spoke from near the back. Calm, unhurried, carrying across the square without effort. An older man stepped forward. Thomas Hail, a plantation owner from the northern edge of the county, known for his wealth, his controlled manner, and his complete intolerance for anything he could not account for. He named a number, not dramatically, not with the flush of competition, simply a number, final and flat, offered in the tone of a man who has decided something and sees no reason to discuss it. No one answered. The auctioneer seized the moment, repeating the bid once, twice, a third time, his voice recovering some of its usual force now that the decision had been made for him. He brought the gavel down. The crowd exhaled together, a collective release that moved through them like a wave, though no one could have said exactly what had been building that required releasing. Nelson did not react to the decision. He stood exactly as he had stood since he stepped down from the wagon, upright, composed, the chains at his wrists catching the light. The guards moved toward him to redirect him, and he went with them without resistance. But before he was fully turned away, he paused for just a moment and looked out at the crowd one final time. Among the gathered faces was a boy of about 12 who had been watching from the moment the wagon arrived. He had not blinked much. He had not spoken. He had watched everything with the complete attention that children give to things they understand are important, even when they cannot explain why. When Nelson's eyes found his, the boy felt something he would spend years afterward trying to describe and never quite manage, a stillness that arrived from the outside and settled into something inside him, a feeling that was not fear and was not comfort, but was something in between that he had no word for. Nelson gave a small smile. It was not the smile of a man who had won anything, or lost anything, or expected anything. It was the smile of a man who had simply seen something clearly and was acknowledging it. Then he turned and stepped into the wagon, and the chains made their sound again, and the square began to empty. People dispersed slowly, in twos and threes, their conversations low and careful. Some tried to explain what they had felt. Others refused to try. A few walked away without speaking to anyone at all, their faces turned inward, working on something they would keep working on for a long time. Thomas Hale approached the wagon. He stood before Nelson for a moment, taking in everything he had purchased with the same measured attention he gave to all his investments. He was a man who believed in control above all other things, in the idea that every situation could be managed if you understood it well enough and applied the right pressure at the right time. He looked at Nelson the way a man looks at something he is trying to fit into a category it refuses to occupy. Nelson looked back at him without expression, without deference, without hostility. Simply back. Hale felt it again, that brief interruption in his own thinking, that small moment of uncertainty that had no business existing in a man like him. He turned away quickly and gave his orders to the overseer, his voice firm, the routine asserting itself, the familiar structure of control closing back around the moment. The wagon moved. It carried Nelson away from the square and onto the road toward Hale's plantation, several miles north through open fields and tree-lined paths. The land moved past slowly in the afternoon heat, the world returning to its usual sounds, birds and wind and the creak of wheels. The other people in the wagon sat in the particular silence of people who have arrived somewhere they did not choose and are trying to understand what it means. Nelson watched the landscape, not with the desperation of someone calculating escape, with the steady, focused attention of someone learning a place, filing it away, understanding it. A guard sitting near him watched this and felt a discomfort he could not organize into words. He had transported people over long distances many times. He had seen every kind of reaction to captivity. He did not know what to do with someone who seemed, in some fundamental way, not to be in captivity. He asked Nelson where he had come from. Nelson turned and looked at him with that same level gaze and said, "I come from where chains do not hold." The guard laughed. It was a short sound, hollow, ending too quickly, leaving a silence behind it that was worse than whatever had preceded it. The other guards exchanged a glance but did not speak. The wagon continued north. The plantation revealed itself gradually as they approached, the way large things do, first as an outline against the sky, then with more detail, the main house rising above the surrounding land, the fields extending in all directions in their neat, terrible order. For most people arriving at such a place for the first time, the sight was an ending, the final closing of a door, a last confirmation of what their lives had become. Nelson looked at it the way he had looked at everything else, as if he was not arriving at an end at all. The days that followed were felt before they were understood. The first morning, the workers who woke near Nelson compared what they had dreamed in low, careful voices: fire that did not burn, chains that lay on the ground instead of hanging from wrists, a figure standing at the center of a storm that could not reach him. The details were different. The feeling was the same, something powerful and uncontained, pressing at the edges of the world they had been told was fixed. Some dismissed it, others could not. In the fields, the change was subtler, but more constant. A man who had worked for years with a pain deep in his back found the pain present, but somehow less commanding, as if it had moved slightly further from the center of him. A woman who had struggled to maintain pace found her body moving with an ease she had not felt in months. No one could trace it to anything visible. Nelson worked alongside them without calling attention to himself, his movements precise and unhurried, his presence steady in a way that seemed to affect the air around him, the way a strong tree affects the wind. The overseer noticed. He was not a man who believed in things he could not explain. which meant he responded to what he was feeling with anger, rather than curiosity. He increased his presence in the fields, raised his voice more frequently, corrected things that did not need correcting. He understood instinctively that his authority was being affected without being challenged, which was the most unsettling kind of threat because it gave him nothing visible to push against. He confronted Nelson directly on the third morning, stood before him in the field, and spoke with the full force of everything he had built his life on. The certainty that the fear he could produce was stronger than anything a man in chains could offer in return. He expected the usual response. He had received it thousands of times. The slight flinching, the lowering of the eyes, the body adjusting itself to make itself smaller. Nelson looked at him, not with defiance, not with anger, with something quieter and more devastating than either. He simply looked, the way a man looks, who has decided that the performance of fear is beneath him, and has stopped performing it. The overseer's words slowed. He lost the sentence he had been building, stood in the field with his mouth slightly open, and a thought that had simply stopped arriving. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, perhaps 3, but the workers around them felt it like a physical thing, like a shift in pressure. And when the overseer recovered himself and moved away, his face harder than before, several of them looked at each other without speaking. Something had changed, not loudly, not in a way that could be reported or punished, but in the way that actually matters, in the place inside a person where they decide what they believe about the world and what they believe about themselves. Something had moved. The fear was still there. It had not disappeared, but it had shown a seam, a place where it was not quite as solid as it had claimed to be. That evening, Nelson sat against the wooden wall of the holding quarters and said to the man who had been asking him questions since the first night, "When people begin to see beyond what they are told, the world begins to change, even if nothing around them moves." The man nodded slowly. He did not understand it completely, but he felt it in the way you feel a truth that is slightly too large for you right now, but that you know you will grow into. The fourth morning arrived with a weight that everyone felt before they opened their eyes. Not dread, not the dread they were used to, the grinding, habitual dread of another day with no end in sight. This was something different. This was the particular weight of a moment that has been building and has finally arrived. The workers rose from the ground and looked at each other and knew without speaking that today was not like the others. The overseer arrived in the field with more force than he had used on any previous morning, as if he too could feel that something was reaching a point and was determined to hold it back with volume and presence and the threat of consequences. He moved through the rows sharply, his eyes everywhere at once, his voice constant. He was working very hard, and it showed, which was itself a kind of loss for a man whose authority had always appeared effortless. When he reached Nelson, he stopped. He delivered his commands with everything he had, the full weight of the system, the full implication of the power he represented, every consequence he had ever made a person fear. He stood close and spoke directly, and waited for the body before him to respond, the way bodies were supposed to respond. Nelson's eyes met his and stayed there. No anger, no challenge, no visible anything except a steadiness so complete that it had its own kind of mass. The overseer was looking at a man who was not afraid of him, not performing fearlessness, not suppressing fear, not holding it down through force of will, simply a man who had made a different arrangement with the world and was standing in it without apology. The overseer's voice faltered. In the middle of a sentence, between one word and the next, the force behind the words gave out, the way a fire gives out when the wood is gone. He stopped speaking. He stood in the Alabama heat in front of a man in chains, and could not find the next word. The silence lasted only a moment, but it was heard by every person within 30 feet of where they stood. One by one, across the field, backs straightened. Not dramatically, not in unison, one at a time, with the particular slowness of people who are learning something and allowing their bodies to adjust to the new information. Eyes that had spent years looking at the ground found the horizon. Hands that had gripped their tools with the tightness of people who carry their fear in their grip loosened slightly. The overseer recovered himself and walked away. He walked faster than he needed to, and did not look back. That night, the plantation was quieter than it had ever been. Not the quiet of exhaustion or suppression, the quiet of people who have been handed something and are holding it carefully, turning it over, understanding that it is fragile, but that it is real. They did not celebrate. They did not speak loudly. They sat in the darkness and felt the difference between a fear that owns you and a fear that you have simply learned to live with, and they understood for the first time that those were not the same thing. Nelson sat among them and said nothing. He did not need to. In the morning he was gone. No broken locks, no disturbed ground, no trail leading away from the building in any direction. The door was as it had been. The chains were on the floor, not forced open, simply lying there as if they had been set down voluntarily by someone who was finished with them. The guards searched for hours. Thomas Hale walked every inch of his land, with the tight expression of a man who needs an explanation and knows he is not going to get one. There was no explanation, there was only the absence, and the people he had left behind, and the thing he had handed them that no one could take back because it was not a physical thing, and because it lived now in a place that no overseer could reach and no chain could find. The story traveled, the way stories travel when they carry something true inside them, from person to person, across distances, changing in the details, but remaining the same in the center. Some people who heard it said he must have escaped, which was the simplest explanation and the most comfortable. Others said something else had happened, something that did not fit inside the word escaped, because escaped suggests a man running from something, and nothing about Nelson had ever suggested he was running. The boy who had watched from the crowd in Greenvale remembered the smile for the rest of his life. He grew up and grew old, and the world changed around him in ways both terrible and remarkable, and through all of it he kept that image, a man in chains on an auction block in the Alabama sun, and a smile that did not belong to sorrow or to joy, but to something that had no name in any language he ever learned. A man who knew something, a man who had looked at the chains on his wrists and made a decision about them that the people who put them there had never anticipated and could not understand, that some things cannot be owned, that the deepest kind of freedom is not something that can be given or taken, but something that lives in the part of a person that the world cannot reach, no matter how hard it tries, no matter what it builds to contain it. Nelson was gone, but what he left behind was still there, in the straightened backs, in the eyes that had found the horizon, in the quiet that had replaced the dread, in the seam that had appeared in the fear, that small irreversible crack through which light had begun, slowly and without announcement, to enter. Some chains are never as strong as they appear, and some men were never meant to be held.